So without further ado, let's get started with our first speaker. And while Satej, we can change the computer, let me introduce you to one of our awesome keynote speakers. It's been now 23 years since you were earlier back in India. He's been in India after a long time. And he came here when he was a 6-year-old. And he remembers Andhra from that time. And I said, I'm pretty sure you will not recognize it here again. But he's been a programmer for the better part of 20 years. His claim to fame has been Ruby tuppers. And I'm sure most of us have already been using a lot of it. And his core strength today has been, and he's an educator. It is something that we are looking forward to. And he still does some consulting. He's all the way from the US. Avdi, over to you.
Thank you. While I'm finishing my setup here, I want you to do me a favor. We clapped for the sponsors already, but I don't think we've clapped for the organizers yet. So if we could get a round of applause. Thank you. So yeah, I am Avdi, and I am so pleased to finally be here at RubyConf India. Like Gautam said, I have been here before, but it's been a very, very long time. Last time I was here, whoops, it would help to turn this thing on. Last time I was here, it was 1993. I was 13 years old. I had much less hair back then, and I remember a lot from that trip. I learned a lot of good lessons from that trip, including lessons that stick with me to this day, even when I'm writing code. One lesson that still sticks with me is that monkey patching is almost never a good idea. So these days, I live in or near the town of Knoxville in Tennessee. And Knoxville is a town that sits right at the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains. And we moved here a few years ago because we'd always wanted to live in a house in the woods, in the mountains. And we managed to find a house just like that, a house in the foothills of the Smokies, back in the woods. And you know, when you have a house in the woods, kind of away from everyone, you start to think it would be nice to have little homesteady things, like, you know, growing your own food and maybe having fresh eggs every day. And in order to have fresh eggs every day, you need chickens. And in order to have chickens and not have them be eaten by the bears, you need a chicken pen, and in order to have a pen, you need a fence, and in order to have a fence, you need fence posts. So one day I went out to the hardware store, and I bought a pile of fence posts, and I bought myself one of these. This is a fence post driver, and it's basically just a tube with one end closed, and you just pound it over and over down on the fence post until the fence post is deep enough in the ground. Or at least, that's the theory. Because it turns out that the ground up there on the hill was more rock than soil, and what I wound up with was just a pile of mangled fence posts. So I realized that my tool was not sufficient for the job, and I went back out to the hardware store. Or actually, no, I didn't go out to the hardware store quite yet, because I had some tools in my garage. I got out my handy post hole digger and my Matic, and I decided I was just going to go and dig some holes. So I started digging, and an hour later, I had one hole. And I realized that this process was not very efficient, and it was not working out. And so at that point, I decided to find some better tools. So I went back out to the hardware store, and I got myself one of these. This is it's called a post hole digger / tamping bar. It's basically a 6-foot steel rod that's been flattened into a chisel at one end, and you use it with the fence post driver, and you just pound it into the ground. It makes a very small, focused hole that's just big enough for a fence post. And this thing worked great. I was able to get a fence post into the ground in like 5 minutes. So I went around putting fence posts into the ground. Unfortunately, I went a little bit fast, and I realized that at the end that some of the early fence posts I had put in were in the wrong places. And so at that point, I needed to pull some of them back out. And what I discovered was that this ground, once you got a fence post into it, it did not want to let go. So I spent a while pulling on them and trying to figure out ways of getting them out of the ground. I could not get them out of the ground. And so I realized my tools were not sufficient. I needed better tools. And so I went back out to the hardware store, and I got myself one of these. And this is a fence post puller. It's basically just a big lever. And this thing worked great. I was able to pull these fence posts out of the ground in like 30 seconds that I could not move with any amount of pulling on my own. So both of these tools, the post hole digger and the fence post puller, these are both examples of leverage. They're examples of tools that allow you to apply a minimum amount of effort to achieve a maximum amount of change in the world. And that makes me think of software. So why do we write code? The most common answer that I hear to this question is to solve problems. And I think this answer is fine as far as it goes. I think some of the applications that we put software to fall nicely into this category. You know, if you just need to like factor some large numbers or any other kind of really algorithmic processing, really feels like puzzle solving of a kind. But you know, a lot of the stuff that we do, a lot of the work that we do, especially in languages like Ruby, I don't feel like this definition really captures it, because a lot of what we do, it's really more about effecting some kind of change in the world. Particularly changes in how we work together, or how we play, how we communicate with each other, or how we coordinate with each other. And code is a very high leverage tool for achieving some of these effects. You know, when we get started as programmers, when we first learn to program, it can feel like acquiring a superpower. It feels like you have this army of robots at your command. You write the code once, and they just keep working and working and working and doing it over and over again. And you know, I come from the States, and in the States that we know, if you have something good, more of it is always better. Well, maybe not, because as I've grown as a programmer, I've realized that code can also have diminishing returns over time. Code can actually be waste sometimes. Raise your hand if you've ever worked on a piece of code for 2 weeks only to have it never be used in production. Keep your hand up if you've ever done that for 2 months. Keep your hand up if you've ever done that for 6 months. It doesn't feel good, does it? You know, when I was getting started as a programmer, I discovered something. I discovered Let me back up. Let me back up a bit. So when I was growing up, my grandfather was a dentist, and I had all this dental paraphernalia around the house. And I always remember there was this magnet on a refrigerator that said, "Ignore your teeth, and they'll go away." And what I discovered early in my programming career is that a lot of times the programming tasks that people gave me could be treated the same way. I could ignore them and they would go away because they'd tell me to work on something and I'd work on it for 6 weeks, and then they'd come along and they'd come along after that and say, "Oh, you know what, the contract changed. We're not actually going to use that after all." So I discovered that, I could just ignore the tasks, and then 50% of them would go away, and then the other 50% I could just cram out really fast. You might have this problem more or less. Some shops aren't going to have as much code as waste, but there are a lot of reasons that code can go to waste. And even when code isn't going to waste, code can often be a distraction for us programmers. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Let's step back to the year 2001. This was a really exciting year for me. I was still getting started in my programming career, and I was using all the spare time that I had from ignoring the programming tasks that people were giving me to learn a lot of interesting new technologies. I was playing around with Perl, with Python, and with Ruby. I was messing around with Linux at home. I was reading this great book called The Pragmatic Programmer by Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas, and I was starting to get involved in the community that was forming around that book. And if you remember, 2001 was like the heyday of the blogging explosion. Suddenly, everybody needed to have a blog. And this would have been the perfect time for me to start my programming blog and start building my programmer profile. I could have written about all this cool stuff that I was learning about, and I really wanted to start a blog. And this is how it would go. I would think to myself, "Hey, I've got something to say. I should write a blog post." So that means I'll need a blog. So let's take a look at the blogging tools that are out there. None of these tools are quite what I want. None of them work exactly the way I want them to, but that's okay. I'm a programmer. I'll write my own blogging tool. So let's see, what kind of features do I want for a blogging tool? Well, let's see. I think I want to be able to attach images to the post. And of course, if I attach an image, I want the image to be resized so it'll load fast on a 28.8 modem. So let's check out some of the imaging libraries that are available for Ruby. Okay, here's a good imaging library, but looks like it has a bug. That's okay, I'm a programmer. I'll fix the bug. I'll just download the source code, and the tests don't pass. All right, so now I need to get the tests to pass. What was I going to write about in the first place? And I went around in this circle for this cycle for 6 years until finally, in 2007, I bit the bullet. I put up a WordPress blog, and I published the first post on my developer blog. So code can be a distraction. But even if we manage to stay focused, code can also be a liability. And this idea of code as a liability is something that a lot of people have written about over the years. Chris Parsons wrote, "Every line you add limits your project's responsiveness to change." Tim Ottinger wrote, "Having more code will reduce your ability to incorporate new programmers." Of course, you'll need more programmers because you have all this code to deal with. Size has a cost. Rich Skrenta wrote that code is bad. It rots. The more code you have, the more places there are for the bugs to hide. Jeff Atwood says the best code is no code at all. And Eric Lee wrote, "Source code is merely the necessary evil that's required to create value." So code is a superpower, but code also has some negatives to it. Code can be waste. Code can be a distraction, and code often is a liability. And the thing is, we're not really here to write code. We're here to affect change in the world. Code is just one tool, one source of leverage to affect that change in the world. So, over the years, I've started looking for ways of avoiding code, of avoiding the need to write code, or the need to write quite as much code, or at the very least, looking for ways to delay the need to write code until it's absolutely necessary. And today, I want to share 4 strategies that I've come up with for avoiding code. The first one is to do the work manually. Let me give you an example of this. Let's say you're writing an ebook, and you're publishing it online, you're publishing drafts online, but you're writing it in a file format that you prefer. For me, this is org mode in Emacs. And in order to publish it, you first need to convert to export these org mode files into HTML. And then you need to push the HTML onto some kind of CMS, let's say WordPress. So, you're a programmer. This is a highly automatable job, so you decide to write some automations for this. Maybe you write them in Rake, so you have some Rake tasks. One of them tells your editor to export the files into HTML, and the other one uploads the files to WordPress. So you get all this automation written, and it's working fine, but then you discover something. You discover that the HTML, which is generated by your tool, or by your editor, is kind of messy. It has a bunch of extra divs and IDs and classes in it, and it messes up the formatting. But that's okay. You've already got some automation. You can just go back to your automation, and you can start adding some code to it that will post-process the HTML and clean up this messiness. So you start writing some methods, each of which addresses a single aspect of the messy HTML and cleans it up. And before long, you've got a little pipeline built of methods that post-process the HTML. Each one takes out a little bit of messiness, so that at the end, you've got perfect, pristine HTML that looks great. All right, so this works, but you've written a fair amount of code for it. Now let's rewind back to the beginning. Let's say you had the same problem, but you decided to put off writing code. You decided to do the work manually at first. And so starting out, you went over to your editor, and you manually told it to export the files to HTML. And then you manually copied and pasted the code, pasted it into WordPress. And it's at this point you realize that the HTML is messy. And you're doing everything manually, so at this point you start going down through the HTML manually, editing the HTML to clean it up. And it sucks. It's tedious. You hate it. And immediately you start thinking, there has got to be a better way. There's got to be a better process that will avoid this pain. And as you're thinking about it, you realize, didn't I hear somewhere WordPress can actually use Markdown as an input instead of HTML? And so you do a little research, and you find the setting in the Jetpack plugin to turn on Markdown. And you go back to your editor, and you tell it to export Markdown, which doesn't have any of that messiness in it. And you copy that, and you paste it in, and it works just fine. And as a result of going through that process, as a result of feeling the pain of manually editing the HTML, you hit upon a process which completely avoided the need for any of that. Something I've realized is that given a tedious and repetitive problem, as programmers, we'll say, I can automate this. Now we have N problems. Or for the computer science nerds among you, now we have NP problems. We have an infinite number of interesting, engrossing little problems to fiddle with. I've realized that as programmers, we can be really good at discovering local maxima and thinking that they are global maxima. By way of example, what I mean by this is that, remember I said that I live on a house in the woods on top of a foothill. It really is, it's on top of the hill. And it's very easy to look down at the valley below us and think, I have reached the highest point. But if I turn around and look through the trees, there's a real mountain behind us that towers far, far over the hill that we're on. And I think we often do this as programmers. We arrive at the most efficient possible automation for some process, but we fail to ask the question, is this the right process? There are a lot of advantages to doing the work manually first. For one thing, you have an opportunity to discover shortcuts to the work before forming a psychological commitment to the code. That sunk cost fallacy where you're thinking, it's 80% of the way done, I'll just finish it. Sometimes you find out the task actually isn't worth automating. It turns out that you only needed to do it once or twice. It gives you an opportunity to discover which of the cases are common and which cases are rare. Because the thing is, when we get a list of requirements, we tend to treat all those requirements as equally important. But when you actually go through the steps manually, sometimes you discover that some of those cases are so rare that it's not worth writing a lot of extra code for them. Maybe we should just find a way to sort of punt on those and handle those differently. It is a lot easier to learn about a process if you're just going through it manually than if you're also trying to automate it at the same time. And once you finally make the decision to automate it, all that manual experience can make the automation a whole lot easier because you are so familiar with it. So the mindset that will help you with this strategy of avoiding code, this strategy of doing the work manually, is to be code averse. And I think that as developers, we're typically the opposite of this. We tend to be pretty code happy because code is fun. Code is what we do. And I think that code often holds the promise of ease. It feels like going down the coding route immediately is the easiest thing to do. But I think that in reality, that doesn't always pan out. The next strategy I want to talk to you about is the strategy of embracing commodities. And by that, I basically mean embracing off-the-shelf software. Now, let me give you an example of this. So, as some of you may know, I publish a screencast series called Ruby Tapas, just short videos for Ruby developers. Is anybody in here subscribed to this? Thank you so much. This literally is what feeds my family, so I really, really appreciate it. So I published this. I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years now. And when I first got it started, I wanted to get started really quickly, and so I just went with a hosted service that somebody had. But the hosted service didn't have a lot of the features that I wanted. And so for a long time, I planned to migrate to something that I wrote myself. And for years, every time I had a few extra hours, I would hack a little on a project that I thought of as Ruby Tapas 2.0. I was going to write my own thing. It was going to have all the features that I wanted. And as I worked on this, I discovered there were a lot of features that I wanted for this site. I mean, I had to handle payments and subscriptions and sending out email notifications, streaming video, downloaded video, having nicely formatted scripts so that people could read along, having good search and categorization. I wanted to be able to organize episodes into courses. We needed RSS feeds, and on and on and on. And I realized after a while that implementing this site could easily become a full-time job in and of itself. And the implication of that was that Ruby Tapas, the screencast series, would become a show all about implementing Ruby Tapas, the site, because that's all I would be thinking about all the time. And I realized that that was not necessarily the show that I wanted to make. But I had this voice in the back of my head saying, I'm a programmer teaching other programmers about programming. If I don't write the site myself, that makes me a hypocrite, right? And maybe you've heard this, this saying, eat your own dog food. The idea that as a programmer, you should be using the software that you're writing. But there are two important caveats to this guideline. And the first one is that you should only be eating your own dog food if your business is making dog food. And secondly, just because you own a dog does not mean that you should be making dog food. And so I took a step back and I thought, you know, what is the actual change that I am trying to affect in the world? And the answer to that was simple. The answer was, I want to make Ruby programmers better at what they do. That's it. And so I decided to throw away everything that I had written so far. And I decided to make a new rule for myself. And the rule was, I will not write a single line of code to sell or deliver my content. Because the thing is, you can kind of divide the work that you do into two rough categories. There's code that's right at the core of your problem. And then there's code that's at the periphery, that's around the edges of it. And it's very easy to put a whole lot of time into code that's at the periphery of your problem. So I thought about some options for how I would re-implement the site. I needed something that was off the shelf now, because I wasn't going to write any code, but it needed to have a sufficient ecosystem, be sufficiently flexible that it could have all the features that I wanted. And there were a few contenders, but the one that stood head and shoulders above all the others was something that I'd already been using for my blogs, and that was WordPress. I want to say a little bit about this. I don't want to bore you with a lot of WordPress stats, but WordPress is basically, at this point, the 800-pound gorilla of content management systems in the open source world. By some counts, it now powers 26% of the entire web, and that number is going up. And it has this huge ecosystem around it of plugins and themes and integrations with other tools. There are lots and lots of developers and designers available for it, and a lot of dedicated hosting companies for it as well. So it's like it is about as commoditized as software gets. So this is what I went with, but there's an obvious objection that could be raised at this point, which is, why would I not implement the site in Rails, being a Ruby programmer and all that? Well, it turns out that for content management, WordPress is to Rails as Rails is to Ruby. You know, any site that you write, somebody could come along and say, well, why didn't you write it in pure Ruby? Any site you create, you could implement in pure Ruby without bringing any framework into the deal. But you use Rails because it takes care of 80% of the tedious, busy work that you don't want to be distracted by. And for the specific application of content management and delivery, WordPress is the same thing. It takes away 80% of the tedious, busy work that you don't want to be bothered with, that you would otherwise be implementing if you were using Rails. Yes, you can write an app in pure Ruby, but when it comes to publishing rich content to the web, it might be better to use a tool specifically designed for the job. And after several years of using WordPress for various content management applications, I've become a little bit opinionated about this, and I'm going to say something which you'll probably find a little bit contentious, and it's this. If your business has a significant content management aspect, by which I mean if part of your business deals with news posts or product listings, portfolios or classified listings, something like that, if that's part of your business, and you're not using WordPress for that part of your business, then you're doing it wrong. By which I mean you are wasting your own time and money or somebody else's time and money. And I know there are going to be some objections to this. For instance, you might be wondering, okay, but how do I integrate it? How would I integrate it with my existing Ruby and Rails services? Or maybe you have some concerns around WordPress security. I'd be happy to talk about these objections on one of the breaks, but there's one objection that I want to address right now, and it's this one. But Avdi, WordPress is written in PHP, and PHP is icky. And this is a serious objection. This is something that I had to address for myself as I was considering going down this road. But I have discovered a technique that deals with this problem, and it is this. It is get over yourself. The thing is, technology bias will stunt your career. It is bad for you. And I feel like I can talk about this because I have held a lot of technology biases over the course of my career. And something that I've learned is that if there is a technology out there that a lot of people are using, but you feel like it is objectively bad, there are two possibilities. Either you are right and everybody else is stupid, or you're missing something important. And it is almost never number one. So we're talking about embracing commodities, using off-the-shelf software. And the number one impediment that I see to using commodities, the number one objection that comes up over and over and over again when I talk to people about how they could be using something off the shelf instead of rewriting it themselves, is the objection, but our workflow is different. This tool would not work with our workflow. This tool, it doesn't work quite right. It doesn't implement quite the right standards. It doesn't use the right file formats. And yeah, when you use off-the-shelf software, you're going to run into things where it doesn't work the way you expect it to, or the way you think you need it to. But if you can bend a little bit, if you can bend your workflow and get your mind around a different way of working, the advantages will often far outweigh the disadvantages. And a lot of times what you'll find down the road is that the reason it works a little differently from the way you think you need it to work is that they've been working on that problem a lot longer than you have, and they've learned why their way of doing things actually works better. The third strategy I want to talk to you about for avoiding code is looking for partial solutions. Looking for ways to solve part of the problem in code instead of all of it. And there's a style of coding that I've found very conducive to producing partial solutions, and I call it externalizing intermediate states. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So I do have some automation for publishing my videos to the RubyTapas site. And I wrote the automation in Rake. And something that I really like about Rake is that it encourages this style of coding where each step in the process is represented by a concrete file which is produced at the end of that step. And so once I've published a video, I have this little subdirectory full of little intermediate files. Each one has a little bit of metadata about the episode that's been captured as part of the process of publishing it. And one day I decided I wanted to implement a new feature. It was the ability to have an iTunes feed for certain users so that they could view the videos in iTunes. And because I was working in WordPress, I was able to drop in a plugin which made this possible without writing any new code. But it did put a new field into the posts that I now had to populate, an extra field that I had to populate. And I didn't have that written into my automations yet. But what I discovered was that one of one of these intermediate files that I had, a YAML file, already had the information that I needed. And I realized that for now, when I was publishing the episodes, I could just dump that file out on the command line. I could copy the URL I needed, I could paste it in, and I could publish the episode. And I could automate it later. But because those intermediate states were externalized in a way that was very accessible to me, I was able to proceed forward without a lot of change in my process. And in a way, this approach changes your code from a black box delivering finished solutions into more of a dialogue with you. And there are a lot of other ways to embrace this approach of making your code into a dialogue. Let me give you another example. In my publishing code, my publishing toolchain, one of the steps is to actually take the video file and push it up to a couple of different hosting services. And most of the time, this works just fine out of the box, but sometimes I've left a couple of extra video files lying around, some drafts or something, and it gets confused over which file to push up. You know, multiple files match the globbing pattern. And I could have handled this a few different ways. I could have just had it fail hard whenever that happens and forced me to go in and delete the wrong file so that just the right file was left. Or I could have, every time this happened, I could have gone into my code and tweaked the file matching code until it only matched exactly the right files. But I decided to go with a third option, which was, if there's more than one possibility, just pop up a prompt. And I just use the Highline library for Ruby to do this. And this happens rarely enough that it doesn't really slow me down, because it's not a common thing. But when it does happen, it pops up the prompt, I pick the one that I need, and I go forward. It's a dialogue with me. It punts the hard questions to me, the user, instead of forcing those decisions to be made in code. And there are a lot of different ways you can do this. It doesn't have to be a prompt at a command line. It could be an email that your code sends you when it runs into something that it can't handle on its own, that doesn't have the logic to handle on its own. It could be a note that your code drops into Slack when it runs into one of these issues. And you could even write a Slack bot that allows you to resolve the issue right there within Slack. One approach that I found really helpful is to have code that will create a new ticket in your customer support system when it runs across a situation that you haven't yet written specialized handling for. And the mindset here is to treat your code as a collaborator with you, not as a black box, but as something that works with you and alongside you. The last strategy that I want to talk about for avoiding code is to consider using non-code tools. And I'll give you one example of this. Recently, I needed to implement a new system. I needed a chore management system because I have 4 kids, and they needed to start pulling their own weight around the house. So I needed to divide up chores among them. And I decided I would prototype the system first. And in order to prototype it, I picked the most popular programming system in the world, a spreadsheet. And I started out just by listing some of the chores that I knew needed to be done. And once I had a decent-sized list, I sorted them by the frequency that they needed to be done at. And I realized that most of the chores needed to be done weekly or more often. There were only a few that needed to be done less often than that. So I decided, for the time being, to just set the chores that needed to be done less often aside, and I would just focus on the weekly chores. So I realized I needed a new view at this point. So I created another spreadsheet, which was a grid breaking down by day of the week and by child. And I wrote an elaborate algorithm to fairly distribute the chores among the different children, Just kidding. I just manually copied and pasted the chores into the new spreadsheet based on my knowledge of the children and their capabilities. And as I did this, sometimes it would start to feel like one of the kids was overloaded and one of the kids didn't have enough work. And because I was working in a spreadsheet, it was very easy to just drag and drop the chores around until I came up with an organization that seemed pretty reasonable. So this was great. I had a nice breakdown of chores by day and by child. And this was fine for me, but I realized, my end users are children ages 3 through 9. And this wouldn't really work for them. I needed a different view for them. And to prototype this end user view, I settled on using a document. And I fiddled around with a few different possibilities for how this would look, but I settled on a set of pages, 1 page per day, broken down by child. And I started populating these pages with the chores that I had put in the previous grid. And after a while, I realized that I was making poor use of horizontal space, and it was running off the bottom of the page. But fortunately, because I was working in a word processor, it was really easy to play around with different formats until I found one that worked. And I love the way that word processors, they're a midpoint between content and style. Doing this reorganization in style, I think was faster for me than it would have been if I had been either working on like a Photoshop mockup or if I had been working on some kind of HTML prototype. So I had identified 3 views. I had a master list of chores, I had a grid by day and by child, and then I had an end user view, these pages, 1 per day. And now I needed to pick a platform to implement this system on. And for my platform, I chose, can you guess it? Just kidding. I picked good old ink on paper. So I printed these pages out and started using the prototype in production. And of course, I ran into bugs in the first iteration, but because I had put these on paper, it was very easy to just modify the system in production to deal with these bugs. And what I discovered was that the end users, they had a lot of commentary and annotations that they wanted to make on the system. And if you think about it, this capability is extremely uncommon in the systems that we deliver, this ability to directly annotate the system in use. The best that most people can do with the systems we give them is to print a screenshot and scribble on that. It also made it really easy for me to take notes. I didn't have to have a separate bug tracking system. I could just flip the pages over and take some notes on what the next iteration should have. I learned some useful things from this prototype. I learned that some chores have temporal dependencies. Particularly, some chores would deadlock on the kitchen sink. And I realized that something very important for the system that I was implementing, which is that I needed to always be able to drag and drop, to reorder the chores into a custom order. It was not going to be sufficient to be able to have them just sorted by, alphabetically or by when I put them in. So I learned a lot of useful stuff, and I'd come up with 3 views. I had my master list, I had my grid, I had my end user view. I knew what the system needed to look like, but I also learned something else, which is that maybe I didn't need to write the system as software at all, because maybe it was sufficient to just print these out every week, or maybe laminate them and use dry erase markers on them. And sometimes we can discover this if we use non-code tools. There may be parts of the process that don't actually need custom software. I think that often when we jump into creating mock-ups or creating prototypes, creating skeletal software to try something out, I think we often kind of do both too much and too little at the same time. because we spend a fair amount of effort getting to an artifact that is not malleable. It's an artifact that, at best, the users, the end users, they can give us feedback on it. But what we can't do is we can't watch them bending it to their use. Whereas when we use things like spreadsheets and documents and just paper, these are artifacts that they're not just accessible to everyone, but they're writable to everyone. And we can collect so much more information about the process and about what people need using artifacts like this. And the overall mindset to embrace for this is to realize that our job really isn't writing software systems. Our job is creating a system of work that is often supported by software. But what we're really creating is the workflows and the ways of thinking about the work. That's our real job. And this brings me to the point of this talk. Our goal is to have maximum impact in the world, to affect change. And to do that, we look for tools with leverage. And sometimes code can be the tool with that leverage, but sometimes not. And as programmers, I think we often fixate on code as our first and only tool of choice. It becomes our all-purpose hammer. And the thing is, we have a very rare and special skill. A skill that's in short supply, that's in high demand. The world needs your skills to accomplish important work. And unfortunately, I think sometimes we can be our own worst enemies as programmers. We can sink so much time into code that is around the periphery of the problems that we're actually trying to address, the work that we're actually trying to do in the world. Because we love to code, right? It's fun. And I'm not here to tell you to start avoiding the thing that you enjoy. It's about focusing your efforts in areas that will have the greatest impact in the world. And avoiding the areas where that effort will be wasted, or where that effort will just leave you on the hook for endless maintenance of software that isn't even at the core of the problem. As new programmers, the ability to code is a superpower. But as we grow in experience, I think we find that also the ability to refrain from coding can be a superpower. You know, we sometimes call ourselves hackers. And if you look at the origin of that word, it goes back to the MIT hack culture of MIT students changing things in the world, doing things like converting the MIT dome into R2-D2. Hacking, right back to the beginning, means affecting changes in the real world. Whether that change be having fresh eggs every day, or whether it's using inventory software to help deliver millions of fresh eggs to thousands of stores, or whether it's just getting kids to do their chores. Sometimes code is our high leverage tool for affecting that change, and sometimes it isn't. Either way, the change itself, the change that we affect in the world, that is where the real fun is. And so I want to encourage you to go out and affect change in the world, using code if necessary, or as I like to say it at the end of all of my Ruby Tapas episodes, happy hacking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Avdi. do we have time for questions, Prathamesh, today? We're already late. Should we do it? No? All right, cool. Thank you so much, Avdi. We'll take Avdi's around the whole day, so please feel free to catch up with him. It's difficult to miss. We have something in common.
I like selfies. Come take a selfie with me.
We have something in common. All right, thank you so much, Avdi.
Thank you.
And there's a little token of appreciation that we have, which is a pretty neat, very customized kind of gift for you. Prathamesh,